October 9th, 1967, a rural schoolhouse in La Higuera, Bolivia. A dirt floor, adobe walls punched through by bullets, a man lying on the ground still breathing, his hands tied. Ernesto Che Guevara, 39 years old. Eyes open, staring at the ceiling. A drunk Bolivian soldier walks into the room. He fires 9 times. The body convulses, and in that instant, somewhere in the world, 5 children have just been orphaned by a man who chose revolution over them. The oldest was 11, the youngest was 2. None of them knew their father had just died. None of them knew they would never see him again, and none of them could imagine what Cuba was about to do to them over the next 58 years. Because the Cuban government did something terrifying. It turned the dead Che into a national saint, and his living children into public ghosts. One of them tried to reveal that his father's diaries had been censored by the regime. He died in a car accident in Venezuela that no one ever investigated. Another became a brilliant doctor, but every time she tried to speak of her father as an imperfect human being, the government edited her words before publishing them. A third discovered that his father's economic theories had failed. He wrote a book with evidence, and Cuban agents visited the publisher in Buenos Aires before it could go to print. A fourth made herself deliberately invisible, stopped using her father's last name, rejected the regime's privileges. She disappeared inside the system as an act of silent resistance. And the fifth died at 39 years old in Havana, without Cuba ever recognizing her as Che's daughter, neither in life nor in death. Because to the Cuban government, the dead Che as an image on t-shirts was infinitely more valuable than his 5 living children as real people. And what they did to that family for 6 decades wasn't negligence. It was a deliberate architecture of silence, surveillance disguised as protection, censorship disguised as preserving the legacy, systematic erasure of anyone who tried to humanize the myth. And there's a question no one dared to ask until now. What would those 5 children think, reading the diaries where their father wrote, "The true revolutionary is guided by great feelings of love," knowing the state built on his image treated them for decades without love at all, only as propaganda tools? In 1967, Cuba needed more than a dead hero. It needed a secular saint, a face on t-shirts that wouldn't speak, wouldn't protest, wouldn't age. Fidel Castro understood this before anyone. The photo of Che taken by Alberto Corta became official propaganda. His image was reproduced on 30-meter murals. But his children lived in a house in the Miramar neighborhood, guarded by state security officers who wrote down every visit. Elena March had been a guerrilla in the Sierra Maestra. She fought. She married Che in 1959. She had 4 children with him between 1960 and 1965. When her husband was killed in Bolivia, she was 31 years old, with an impossible decision in front of her. Allow the Cuban state to manage her husband's memory or lose everything. She chose the first. There was no visible signature, no public document, but there was a tacit understanding that stretched for decades. She would guard Che's personal archive, oversee the official publications about him, and in return, her children would have education, protection, and a life inside the system. What they would not have was the freedom to redefine who their father had been outside the official narrative. But wait, because for a long time, no one dared to ask what those children felt growing up under the shadow of a national myth. No one investigated what happened when they wanted to speak of their father as a human being, not as a symbol of permanent revolution. But buried truths always find a way out. If you also believe there are stories that deserve to be told without fear, subscribe, because what you're about to hear was silenced for decades. The rumors began in 1970. A distant cousin of Che tried to publish a book of family memories in Buenos Aires. The manuscript disappeared before it could go to print. In 1975, Hilda Guevara Gadea, the Che's oldest daughter, from his first marriage to the Peruvian Hilda Gadea, tried to visit Cuba from Mexico. They denied her a visa without explanation. For years, the only daughter of Che who didn't live on the island was treated as if she didn't exist. Inside Cuba, the 4 children of Elena March and Che grew up in a world of watch privilege. They attended special schools for the children of officials. They had access to food the rest of the country never saw. But every letter they received was read first by state security. Every new friend was investigated. Every word they said in public was monitored. And no one imagined what would come next because in 1995, something cracked. Camilo Guevara March, Che's second son, began working at the Che Guevara Study Center in Havana. His job, preserve his father's memory, his discovery. The official version of Che edited, omitted, and rewrote entire passages of his diaries to make them politically convenient. Camilo didn't denounce it publicly, but he began to act differently. He stopped giving interviews. He started quietly to investigate original documents the government had filed away without publishing. And in 2013, in a private conversation recorded without his consent and leaked years later, he said something devastating. My father wouldn't recognize what they did with his words. In that silence, the second life of Che Guevara's children began. Aleida Guevara March was born on November 17, 1960 in Havana. Her father was 32 and had just been named president of the National Bank of Cuba. The girl spent her early years in a house where her father worked until 3 a.m., smoked Monte Cristo cigars while reading economic reports, and every so often vanished for weeks on international missions no one explained. When Aleida turned 4, her father left for Bolivia. He never came back. She kept one memory, him bending down to kiss her forehead before walking out the door. He smelled like tobacco and Soviet cologne. He told her, "Be good to your mother." They were his last words to her. Growing up as Aleida Guevara in Cuba after 1967 meant being an icon without choosing to be one. When she was 8, they took her to an event at Plaza de la Revolucion where they projected Che's image on a giant screen. Children from all over the country sang revolutionary hymns. Aleida sat in the front row, frozen. Everyone watched her father on the screen. No one watched her, yet she knew if she cried, the press would photograph her tears and turn them into propaganda. She learned not to cry in public. She studied medicine at the University of Havana. She wanted to be a pediatrician. She wanted something of her own, separate from the surname. But every time she signed a document, the nurses stopped talking. Professors treated her with uncomfortable deference. Patients asked for autographs instead of diagnoses. Her last name arrived before she did. Every conversation began with it. In 1985, at 25 years old, Aleida made a radical decision. She asked for permission to work in Angola as an internationalist doctor, not on official missions with media coverage on rural hospitals where no one knew who her father was. For 2 years, she was just Dr. Aleida. She treated war wounds, complicated births, childhood malaria. For the first time in her life, her work mattered on its own. But when she returned to Cuba in 1987, a brutal surprise was waiting. The Ministry of Culture had organized an exhibition about the children of revolutionary martyrs. They wanted to include photos of her in Angola. They wanted her to give interviews about continuing Che's legacy. She refused. They warned her that rejecting a public homage to Che was counter-revolutionary. She agreed to one interview, just one. And in that conversation, she said something the government edited before publishing. My father was a man, not a poster. He had doubts, he made mistakes, and he loved his children more than the revolution will ever recognize. The published version said, my father gave his life for a better world. That was the exact moment Aleida understood she would never be allowed to speak of her father as a human being inside Cuba. Every word of hers would be filtered, corrected, turned into a slogan. For the next 20 years, she limited her public appearances to the absolute minimum. She worked in hospitals. She raised her children. And in private, she began to keep a diary where she wrote down everything she couldn't say out loud. What her father was really like when he came home exhausted. How he argued with Aleida March about raising the kids. How, one day, he confessed to her mother that he missed Argentina with a nostalgia that tore him apart. That diary was never published. But in 2017, during the 50th anniversary of Che's death, Aleida gave an interview where she allowed something unprecedented. She spoke about absence. My father loved us, she said, but he chose the revolution every time, and we grew up knowing we were secondary. That sentence caused immediate controversy. Sectors of the Cuban government called it emotional revisionism. Aleida didn't retract it. She simply stopped giving interviews. Today she is 64 years old. She lives in Havana. She treats patients in a clinic in the Vedado neighborhood. She rejects invitations to official events about Che. And when people ask about her father, she always says the same thing. He was a complicated man who made impossible choices, and we lived with the consequences. Her silence now isn't resignation, it's protection, because she learned that in Cuba, speaking honestly about Che Guevara from inside his own family is a political act no one forgives. Camilo Guevara March was born on May 20th, 1962. His father was in Czechoslovakia negotiating trade agreements. He learned about the birth by telegram. It took him 3 weeks to meet his son. Camilo was the only boy carrying the name of another revolutionary icon, Camilo Cienfuegos, the commander who disappeared in a mysterious plane crash in 1959. Two Camilos, two myths, one child who would grow up under the symbolic weight of both without choosing either. When he was 5, playing in the garden of their house in Miramar, Camilo found a metal box buried under a tree. Inside were photos of his father in the Sierra Maestra, letters written to his mother, and a notebook where Che wrote personal reflections. Camilo couldn't read yet. He took the box to Aleda March. She took it in silence, locked it in her room, and never mentioned it again. Years later, Camilo would search for that box. He never found it. He studied law at the University of Havana. He was brilliant photographic memory, exceptional analytical ability. But every essay he wrote went through ideological review before being graded. His professors treated him with a mix of admiration and fear. Admiration for his intelligence, fear that he might say something that compromised the regime. In 1988, at 26, Camilo began working at the Che Guevara Study Center. His official function was to organize Che's personal archive. His discovery was that dozens of letters, diaries, and original documents had been altered before publication. He found, for example, a letter from Che to Fidel Castro dated 1965, where Che expressed doubts about the economic viability of the Cuban model. The published version deleted the entire paragraph of doubts and kept only the final line, "I will continue fighting wherever necessary." He found a diary from Bolivia where Che wrote, "Sometimes I wonder if my children will ever forgive me." That page was never included in any official edition. Camilo began secretly photographing the original documents before they were filed away. He didn't know what he would do with those photos. He only knew the official Che was being built on deliberate omissions. In 1995, during an internal meeting at the Studies Center, Camilo suggested publishing a complete, uncensored edition of Che's diaries. They told him certain fragments could be misinterpreted by enemies of the revolution. They asked if he was willing to put his father's legacy at risk for unnecessary documentary purism. Camilo didn't answer, but he stopped proposing complete editions. In the years that followed, Camilo became the public face of the Guevara family. He traveled to Argentina, Bolivia, Venezuela. He gave lectures about his father, always with an approved script, always saying what was expected. But those who knew him privately noticed something. He spoke of Che with a strange distance, as if describing a historical figure, not his father. In 2013, during a visit to Buenos Aires, an Argentine journalist managed to record him in a private conversation after a lecture. The recording leaked years later. In it, Camilo said, "My father wrote that the true revolutionary is guided by great feelings of love, but he was never home for birthdays. He never watched us grow up. And when I read his letters where he says he misses us, I wonder if he truly understood what it means to miss someone." The leak caused an uproar. Pro-government Cuban sectors accused the journalist of emotionally manipulating Camilo. Critics of the regime celebrated it as proof that even Che's children recognized their father's contradictions. Camilo never confirmed or denied the recording. He simply withdrew from public lectures for 2 years. On August 29, 2017, Camilo died in a car accident in Venezuela. He was 55. He was traveling in a truck that lost control on a road near Caracas. He died instantly. The Venezuelan government declared 3 days of national mourning. Fidel Castro's son tweeted, "A brother has left us." But something didn't add up. Camilo was an experienced driver. The road was in good condition. It wasn't raining. There was no traffic, and the vehicle had been mechanically inspected 2 days earlier. Aleda March never spoke publicly about the circumstances of her son's death, but in a private conversation recorded years later by a relative, she said something chilling. Camilo knew too much, and at some point, knowing too much becomes dangerous. To this day, there is no official investigation into the accident, only a 3-page Venezuelan report that concludes, "Loss of control of the vehicle for undetermined causes." Camilo left 2 children, a widow, and an impossible legacy. He was the son of Che, who came closest to revealing his father's uncomfortable truths, and he died before he could do it. Celia Guevara March was born on June 14, 1963. Her father was in Algeria. He didn't make it in time to meet her either. Celia was the most invisible of the four, not by choice at first, but by design. While Aleida became a visibly public doctor and Camilo became the guardian of the archive, Celia chose something radical: normality. She studied veterinary medicine. She worked in clinics for domestic animals in middle-class neighborhoods of Havana. She married young to an agricultural engineer. She had 3 children, and for decades lived as if her last name were just another one. But normality was impossible. Every time she took her dog to a public veterinary clinic, pet owners asked for photos. Every time she enrolled her children in school, teachers gave them preferential treatment. Every time she tried to buy from a ration store, employees offered her products unavailable to everyone else. Celia rejected privileges again and again, and that created discomfort because rejecting privilege in Cuba is implicitly criticizing the system that offers it. In 1998, Celia made a decision that surprised everyone. She asked to work in a veterinary clinic in Pinar del Rio, a rural province 3 hours from Havana. She wanted distance. She wanted anonymity. For 5 years, she treated farm animals in agricultural cooperatives: cows, pigs, horses. None of them knew who their revolutionary great-grandfather was. But in 2003, the government organized an international tour of the children of revolutionary heroes. They wanted Celia to travel to Italy and give talks about Che. She refused. They told her it was a historical responsibility. She replied, "My responsibility is to my patients and my children." Her veterinary license was suspended for 6 months for lack of cooperation with cultural initiatives of national interest. That was the price of saying no. Celia returned to Havana. She went back to working in clinics, but something had changed. She stopped attending family events where the presence of the Guevaras was expected. She stopped answering journalists' calls. And in 2010, in an interview for an independent Cuban documentary that was never authorized for distribution, she said something devastating. "My father died before I turned 5. I don't remember him. I don't remember his voice, his smell, the way he laughed. Everything I know about him comes from photos, speeches, and documentaries. But everyone expects me to love him as a hero. How do you love someone you only know as an image?" And that question was never answered in the documentary because the documentary was never released. Today, Celia is 61 years old. She lives in Havana. She works at a veterinary clinic in the Vedado neighborhood. Her children grew up, studied, work in fields unrelated to politics or history, and she keeps such a low profile that most Cubans under 40 don't even know she exists. Her invisibility isn't cowardice, it's silent resistance. Because Celia understood something her siblings took years to grasp. In Cuba, the only way to live without being turned into a symbol is to refuse to participate in the spectacle. Ernesto Guevara March was born on February 24, 1965. His father was preparing his secret departure to the Congo. He saw him born. He held him for 15 minutes. Then he left to organize a guerrilla movement in Central Africa. Ernesto was the youngest child, the one who spent the least time with his father, the one with the fewest real memories, and paradoxically, the one who felt the greatest pressure to resemble Che. Physically, Ernesto was identical to his father. The same facial structure, the same wavy hair, the same intense gaze. At 20, if he grew a beard, he was an exact copy of Che at 30, and that followed him his entire life. He studied economics at the University of Havana. He wanted to understand his father's economic theories. He wanted to know whether they were truly viable or merely utopian romanticism. He read all of Che's economic writings. He read Milton Friedman, Hayek, Keynes. And he reached a devastating conclusion. His father's economic policies had failed in Cuba, not because of external sabotage, but because they were internally unworkable by design. He never said this publicly, but his undergraduate thesis, revised and corrected 3 times by ideological committees, was a critical, constructive analysis of centralized planning. The final version removed all real criticism and kept only vague suggestions for improving the system. In 1991, at 26, Ernesto asked for permission to pursue a master's degree in economics in Mexico. They denied him permission to leave. They told him his presence in Cuba was strategic for preserving Che's memory, which really meant they didn't trust him to come back. During the 1990s, the special period devastated Cuba. Hunger, blackouts, economic collapse. Ernesto worked at the Ministry of Economy. He saw the real reports that were never published. He knew the figures on poverty, child malnutrition, hospital closures, and he knew that economic policies inspired by his father's ideas had contributed to the disaster. In 1995, during an internal ministry meeting, Ernesto proposed something radical, opening parts of the Cuban economy to the market. Not full privatization, just zones of economic flexibility. They told him that was betraying Che's legacy. Ernesto replied, "My father died 28 years ago. The Cuban economy died too." That sentence cost him his job. He was reassigned to an administrative position at the Institute of Cuban History. No real responsibilities, no access to sensitive information, a bureaucratic exile. What no one knew was that Ernesto had begun secretly writing a book. Che Was Not Right, an economic analysis of a utopia. In it, he rigorously analyzed why his father's economic theories had failed. It wasn't a personal attack, it was a technical study. But in Cuba, questioning Che's ideas meant questioning the foundations of the regime. Ernesto finished the manuscript in 2003. He secretly sent it to a publisher in Argentina. The publisher agreed to release it. But before the book could go to print, Cuban state security agents visited the publishing house in Buenos Aires. They didn't threaten anyone. They simply asked, "Are you sure you want to publish this?" The contract was canceled. Ernesto never tried to publish the book again, but he kept the manuscript. And in 2017, after his brother Camilo's death, he sent digital copies to 3 trusted journalists, one in Argentina, one in Spain, one in the United States, with a single instruction: if anything happens to me, publish it. To this day, the book has never been published, but its existence is an open secret in international academic circles. Ernesto is now 60 years old. He lives in Havana. He teaches economics at the university. He avoids interviews. And when asked about his father, he always says the same thing. He was an idealist. Idealists move the world, but not always in the right direction. That deliberate ambiguity is how he survives. Because Ernesto learned that openly criticizing Che in Cuba meant losing everything, but staying completely silent meant betraying himself. So he chose the middle ground, permanent ambiguity. But one story is still missing: the forgotten daughter, the one who never truly lived in Cuba, the one the regime erased from the official narrative, even in death. Hilda Guevara Gadea was born on February 15, 1956, in Mexico. Her mother, Hilda Gadea, was a Peruvian economist in exile. Her father, Ernesto Che Guevara, was an unemployed Argentine doctor who spent his days debating Marxism in Mexico City cafes. Hilda was Che's first child, the only one who knew him before he became a legend, the one who saw her father as a man, not a myth. She was 3 when her parents divorced. Che had fallen in love with Aleida March in the Sierra Maestra. Hilda Gadea accepted the divorce without scandal. But one thing became clear: Hilda, the child, was the daughter of the pre-revolutionary Che and, in the Cuban official narrative, that Che did not exist. Only the Che after 1959 mattered. Hilda grew up in Peru, then Mexico. She visited Cuba once, in 1961 when she was 5. Her father received her in his office at the Ministry of Industries. He sat her on his lap, showed her maps of industrial projects, gave her a cloth doll, and told her something she would remember for the rest of her life. "You're going to be free, Gildita. Freer than I am." It was the last time she saw him. When Che died in 1967, Hilda was 11. She cried for days. She wanted to travel to Cuba for the symbolic funeral. Her mother explained there was no body, no funeral, that Che was buried somewhere in Bolivia, in a place no one knew exactly. In 1975, at 19, Hilda tried to visit her half-siblings in Cuba. She applied for a visa. It was denied without explanation. She called the Cuban embassy in Mexico. They told her there was no record of any visa application under her name. She insisted. She wrote letters to Aleida March. She never received a response. She wrote directly to Fidel Castro. The letter was never answered. What Hilda didn't know was that there was an internal instruction at Cuba's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Hilda Guevara Gadea must not be officially recognized as Che's direct family. Her existence complicated the revolutionary family narrative, because Hilda represented something Cuba needed to erase the Che before the revolution. The man who had a life in Mexico, who married a non-Cuban woman, who had a daughter outside the revolutionary project. For years, Hilda lived her life. She worked as a psychologist, she married, she had children, and every time she saw her father's image on a t-shirt, she felt pride and rage. Pride because her father mattered. Rage because no one acknowledged that she existed. In 1984, she tried again to travel to Cuba. Her visa was denied a second time. No explanation, just a red stamp on her application. Denied. She tried contacting her half-siblings through acquaintances. The letters never arrived, or if they did, they were never answered. She didn't know whether her siblings were deliberately ignoring her or whether the government intercepted everything. The truth was the latter, but she never knew for sure. In 1990, after 15 years without answers, Hilda made a decision. She would stop trying. She would live her life, raise her children, and let Cuba erase her. Fighting institutional oblivion was a battle she couldn't win. But in 1995, something forced her to try one last time. She was sick, lung cancer. Doctors gave her months to live. And before dying, she wanted to see her siblings. She wanted to step on the land where her father had become a myth. She wanted, if only for one day, to be recognized as Che Guevara's daughter. She applied for a humanitarian visa. She explained her medical condition. She attached doctors' letters. She asked for 1 week in Cuba. Just one. The visa was denied for the third time. Instead, Ernesto began working as a private economic consultant for small agricultural cooperatives in the informal economy that had grown in Cuba after Raul Castro's limited reforms. Celia, meanwhile, achieved something none of her siblings had managed to do. She became genuinely invisible. In 2021, a Spanish journalist tried to locate her for a documentary. He asked at veterinary clinics across Havana. No one knew where she worked. He asked at the Che Guevara Studies Center. They told him the Guevara family values its privacy. He asked at the Ministry of Culture. They said they didn't have up-to-date information on all of Che's descendants. Celia had disappeared without leaving Cuba, an extraordinary feat in a country where state surveillance is omnipresent. She achieved it through a simple but effective method, living exactly like any middle-class Cuban woman. No privileges, no connections, no participation in official events, no signing petitions or manifestos, an existence so ordinary that the state stopped considering her relevant, and that was precisely her strategy. But there was something else the Cuban government had tried to erase for decades: the relationships among the Guevara siblings. Because they weren't a united family. They were 5 people who shared a last name and a tragedy, but who chose radically different paths to survive. Aleida chose controlled confrontation speaking just enough to preserve her dignity, staying silent enough to keep her job. Camilo chose clandestine investigation, documenting quietly, waiting for the right moment that never came. Celia chose invisibility, disappearing inside the system, becoming irrelevant to power. Ernesto chose ambiguity, speaking truths wrapped in academic language, criticizing without denouncing. Hilda chose the impossible search, trying for 39 years to be recognized, and dying without ever achieving it. The tensions between them were real. Aleida and Camilo argued for years about how much of Che's archive should be revealed publicly. Camilo wanted everything published. Aleida feared the full truth would destroy her father's legacy. They never reached an agreement. Camilo's death in 2017 closed that door forever. Celia and Ernesto barely spoke. Celia believed Ernesto was too intellectual, too obsessed with economic theory, too detached from everyday Cuban reality. Ernesto believed Celia was a coward, that her invisibility was surrender. Neither understood the other's survival strategy. And Hilda. Hilda was the ghost everyone knew about but no one mentioned until it was too late. In 2015, 20 years after her death, Aleida tried to investigate what had really happened to her older sister. She obtained the death certificate, visited the grave, spoke to the nurse who attended Hilda in her final hours, and discovered something that shattered her. Hilda had asked that a Aleida March be called. She had asked to see her family before dying, and no one made the call. Aleda never spoke publicly about this, but in a 2022 interview, when asked if she had any regrets in life, she said something strange. My greatest regret isn't something I did. It's something I didn't know in time, and now it's impossible to fix. No one understood what she meant, but those who knew Hilda's story understood immediately. In 2023, something unexpected happened. The Cuban government announced it would turn the house where Che lived with Aleda March and their 4 children into a museum of Che Guevara's private life. The announcement triggered mixed reactions. Aleda Guevara publicly opposed it. In a statement, she said, "My father's private life is not the property of the state. It belongs to his children, and we do not authorize this conversion." The government ignored her opposition. The house was turned into a museum anyway. But something curious happened at the inauguration. None of Che's children attended. Aleda, Celia, and Ernesto sent messages saying prior work commitments prevented them from being there. It was an obvious lie, and the government knew it, but it couldn't force them to attend without creating an international scandal. The inauguration went ahead with government officials, official historians, and tourists, but without the Guevara family. And that absence spoke louder than any speech. In that moment, something became clear. After 56 years of trying to control Che's legacy through his children, Cuba had lost. Not because the children openly rebelled, but because they chose something more devastating: indifference. They no longer cared about fighting for their father's memory. They no longer cared about correcting the official narrative. They no longer cared about being included in state ceremonies. After decades of negotiating with power, they finally chose to let go. Aleda, at 63, continued treating patients. Celia continued healing animals. Ernesto continued providing private economic consultations. And none of them spoke about Che in public anymore. They had learned something brutal. The most effective act of resistance against a government that turns your father into propaganda isn't confrontation. It's becoming irrelevant to its narrative. It's denying them the one thing they need: your participation in the spectacle. Today, in 2025, Che Guevara's surviving children are elderly adults. Aleda is 64, Celia is 61, Ernesto is 60, Camilo died at 55, Hilda died at 39. None of the 3 survivors hold positions of power in Cuba. None are recognized celebrities on the island. None are regular guests at official events. The Cuban government keeps them in a strange limbo, neither openly repressing them nor genuinely recognizing them. They are public ghosts, visible in theory, invisible in practice. Their own children. The grandchildren of Che have chosen paths even further removed from the surname. Some studied abroad and never return. Others live in Cuba, but work in fields completely unrelated to politics or history. Engineers, musicians, English teachers. None use Guevara as their primary last name. None speak publicly about their revolutionary great-grandfather. They understood something their parents took decades to learn. The only way to be free in Cuba when you carry a mythical surname is to refuse to carry the myth. The question no one dares to ask out loud in Cuba is this: what would Che Guevara think if he knew what the Cuban state did to his children? He would probably think the revolution betrayed the one thing he valued above power: authenticity. Because Che wrote in his diaries that the true revolutionary is guided by great feelings of love. But the state built on his image treated his children not with love, but with calculated manipulation. It gave them privileges with one hand and surveillance with the other. It allowed them to study, work, live, but never to exist fully as people independent of the symbol. Every time they tried to speak of their father as an imperfect human being, they were silenced. Every time they tried to live normal lives, they were pulled back into the revolutionary spectacle. Every time they tried to leave, they were restrained physically or emotionally. And Hilda was simply erased, denied in life, ignored in death, buried with an incomplete name in a grave no one visited for years, as if she had never existed. As if the daughter Che had before the revolution were a historical error that needed to be archived and forgotten. That was Che Guevara's true legacy. Not a better world, not a permanent revolution, but 5 children who spent their lives trying to escape the shadow of a man who chose history over them. Because in the end, power fades, regimes change, revolutions grow old. But the real people trapped inside the myth remain with their scars, their silences, their interrupted lives. Elena March, the widow, is now 89 years old. She still lives in Havana, rarely leaving her home. Those who know her say she speaks bitterly, in private, about how the Cuban state used her husband's image to build propaganda while ignoring his real children. But she never says it publicly. After 6 decades of negotiating with power, she learned that some truths are only spoken behind closed doors. Che's complete diaries, uncensored, unedited, without omissions, remain locked in state security archives in Havana. His children know they exist. They know they contain reflections about them, doubts about the revolution, internal criticisms of the Cuban government, but they will never have full access to them. Because for Cuba, the real Che, with his contradictions, his mistakes, his humanity, is less valuable than the mythical Che. And preserving the myth requires controlling the truth. If you believe there are still truths buried in the shadows of power stories about children who grew up under the unbearable weight of revolutionary surnames, then you need to know what happened to the family of Hugo Chavez. Because what happened to his children was even more brutal. A man who idolized Che, who tried to replicate his revolution in Venezuela, and whose family paid a price no one anticipated. Because while Che's children were silenced through calculated surveillance, Chavez's children were destroyed through public violence. One ended up in exile, accused of massive corruption that made him one of the most wanted people in Latin America. Another died under circumstances that still raise unanswered questions. And his daughter became the most hated woman in Venezuela while amassing a fortune worth billions as the country sank into misery. Subscribe so you don't miss that story, because what comes next was also silenced for years and it needs to be told. Because the silenced truths about Che Guevara's children finally found their voice. Not in official speeches, not in state museums, not in government ceremonies, but in the deliberate silence of 4 people who decided that the best way to honor their father was to live the lives he never allowed them to have. Lives of their own, far from the myth, far from the revolution, far from the power that used them as symbols and discarded them as people. And in the forgotten death of a 5th daughter, who spent 39 years searching for recognition and died alone in a Havana hospital, buried with an incomplete name, as if she had never existed. Because the greatest revolutionary act of Che Guevara's children was not continuing his legacy. It was refusing to carry it. And the greatest crime of Cuba was not silencing them in life. It was erasing Hilda even in death.